Pleasure to be here with you. Good afternoon. My name is Roberto Benetello. I'm the Executive Director of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Malaysia. And welcome to this webinar entitled Business for Human Rights and the Environment. This event is brought to you by BCSD Malaysia and our event partner for today, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, RWI. I wish to start by thanking all of you for spending your Friday afternoon with us today. We really appreciate the effort. I also want to thank the distinguished speakers that have agreed to join us today. We will introduce them one by one in a few moments. Ladies and gentlemen, before we go into the topic of the day, allow me to remind you who we are. BCSD Malaysia is a CEO-led no-profit organization, which is formed by a group of forward-thinking companies committed to creating a sustainable future for business, society, and the environment. We are the global network partner in Malaysia of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. Together with our member companies, we want to drive the big transformations that are essential to transition to a world where over 9 billion people can live well and must live well within the planetary boundaries by 2050, by mid-century. At the same time, we strive to make more sustainable business more successful, because this is our mission, help sustainable companies also to become more successful. As I mentioned, we are a membership organization, and during our events, we take the opportunity to welcome our new members. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome two very large organizations, Malaysia Development Bank, Bank Pembangunan Malaysia Berhad, and Top Glove Corporation. I wish to thank these two prestigious organizations for joining BCSD Malaysia. I know that some people from these two companies are actually here with us today. So, like WBCSD, we work with business mostly around 6 main program areas where systems transformation is needed. These areas are circular economy, city and citizen mobility, climate and energy, food and nature, social issues and human rights, and reporting and governance. Today, we will focus on human rights. In these areas, we initiate projects with concrete and measurable output. They all take a science-based approach and aim for targeted business solutions to scale up business impact. If we look at the World Business Council at a global level, they currently have 36 projects ongoing, but there are hundreds of local projects from the 62 WBCSD global network partners around the world. These are companies like BCSD Malaysia and the BCSD organizations that you can see in this slide. The knowledge that is generated through the global and the local projects is used to initiate and replicate projects in some other parts of the world. This approach leverages on our success and minimizes the wasting time and resources to try to reinvent the wheel. So it's very important, the fact that we can utilize the experience and the knowledge that has been generated and produced by other BCSD organizations around the world in the very, very many projects that we are initiating everywhere. So let's go to today's agenda, ladies and gentlemen. In recent years, the link between human rights and the environment has gained increased traction, together with the escalating global expectations that business need to act responsibly to minimize their contribution to potential future climate change. In addition, the health, social, and economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 is fast becoming a human rights crisis. Consequently, responsible business conduct is becoming even more important, as it is the risk of reputation and potentially legal damage for companies. Restarting the economy, the economic recovery, will require business leaders to innovate and build back better, and especially on a smart climate path. The business case for the corporate sector to prioritize the right to a healthy environment is becoming part and parcel of corporate policies and strategies towards ensuring responsible and sustainable business practices. Today, our esteemed speakers will share with us the regulatory aspects of business and human rights from a global, regional, and from a Malaysia perspective. This will be covered during session 1. So session 1 will be about the regulatory aspects. We will also have speakers from 2 different business sectors to tell us about the challenges and the opportunities in corporate responsibility in the respect and remedy of human rights and the environment. This will be actually session 2. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me to share with you a couple of housekeeping items. As you may imagine, the webinar is being recorded. All the participants will be kept on mute during the webinar. However, you can ask your questions by clicking on the Q&A panel. So feel free to ask your questions there. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So this webinar is important because it marks the start of a formal relationship between BCSD Malaysia and the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. The Institute is one of the most prestigious and active organizations worldwide in the field of human rights, and we're very honored and privileged to work with RWI. They combine evidence-based human rights research with direct engagement in close collaboration with many different partners around the world to bring about human rights and human rights change for all. Through the partnership with RWI, we will be able to offer companies in Malaysia first-class training and support on tackling human rights and environmental related issues. This institute, RWI, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, is named after a person, Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who saved tens of thousands of Jews and other people at risk in Hungary at the end of World War II. And today, ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have His Excellency Dag Junglin Danfeld, Ambassador of Sweden to Malaysia, to give the opening remarks, sharing with us his views on the subject matter, and perhaps, hopefully, say a few words on a fellow Swede, Raoul Wallenberg. He will be the right introduction to this event. So, dear Ambassador, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. If everything okay technically, you can take over, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
I hope that you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, we can indeed.
As Roberto hinted, we've been having a bit of technical problems with the computer system, but hopefully everything should work out fine. Let me know if somehow I'm no longer, my voice doesn't carry through any longer. Thank you, first of all, to Business Council for Sustainable Development for having me, for inviting me to say a few introductory remarks at this webinar, whose topic, Business and Human Rights and the Environment, is indeed both timely and highly pertinent, given the state of affairs in the world at present. And I'm especially happy that today's webinar is a bit of a Malaysian-Swedish partnership or joint venture, yeah, as it's done in partnership with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, yeah, which, as Roberto said, is a leading research and education institute on human rights that happens to be situated in Sweden. It's not a Swedish organization per se, rather an international one, but it is headquartered in Lund, Sweden, and even though it has a very impressive and large international presence. And it was worthwhile mentioning that my government, the Swedish government, frequently seeks the advice of the institute on issues regarding human rights, yeah, which is of core importance for Swedish foreign policy, as is sustainability, sustainable development as well. You know? And through my years as a diplomat, plus 30 years now, I've had the honor and pleasure of interacting with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute on many occasions in different parts of the world where I've been acting. As stated by Roberto, the institute is named after Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, who indeed saved many lives during the end phase of the Second World War, notably primarily Jews, but also other persons with a belonging that made them persecuted by the Nazi regime and the proto-Nazi regime that was in place in Hungary at the time, saving tens of thousands of people from being sent to concentration camps or extermination camps in the last year of the Second World War. Raoul Wallenberg paid for this with his life. Upon the liberation of Budapest or conquest of Budapest by Soviet troops, Raoul Wallenberg, who had navigated the terrain of Hungarian fascists and German Nazis successfully, in the end he was imprisoned by Soviet troops and disappeared. By now we presume sadly that he is dead, but Raoul Wallenberg is indeed still very much an unfinished item on the bilateral agenda between Russia and Sweden still today. In addition to Raoul Wallenberg, it's worthwhile mentioning also Dag Hammarskjöld. I mean, we as a Swede, I would say we have two Swedish diplomats of international repute. One of them is Raoul Wallenberg. The other one is Dag Hammarskjöld, the second UN Secretary General, who also passed away in line of duty, trying to mediate peace in the Congo Civil War in the early 1960s. And I think these two persons, Raoul Wallenberg and Dag Hammarskjöld, are leading stars, setting the standard for humanitarian work and humanitarian diplomacy still today. Raoul Wallenberg also symbolizes, in a way, the connection between business and human rights, because Raoul Wallenberg, as the name implies, belonged to a family, one of Sweden's foremost business families, the Wallenberg family, and that holds controlling states in a multitude of Swedish multinational companies such as Ericsson, ABB, SKF, Saab, and many others. And Raoul Wallenberg could have made other choices than going to Budapest during World War II. But he did. He did go to Budapest with the support of his family and on an extremely dangerous diplomatic mission. And as I said, ultimately paid with his life for this. As for the topic of today, business and human rights and the environment, there's a lot of things written on sustainable business. For us, I mean, the UN Global Compact and its sustainable development goals focus on different facets of sustainable development, which kind of shows the way or act as roadmaps for businesses that want to become sustainable. And key areas, obviously, is human rights, working conditions of labor, anti-corruption, and the environment, climate change, loss of biodiversity. The term sustainable business is usually used to describe how companies should integrate environmental and social sustainability to be a core part of their operations, and the work companies do to ensure that their activities have a positive impact on society, the environment, and the economy. Efforts to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, to promote transparency, fair pay, gender equality, equal career opportunities, and involvement with local communities are some examples of sustainable business initiatives, key components of the notion sustainable business or sustainability leadership. For many companies, I think, in different parts of the world, sustainability is an obvious necessity and part of their core business, while others, maybe still the majority, may feel that it's a bit of a challenge, sometimes discouraging challenge, implying unnecessary costs. Concerns about reduced profit margins or need or undue needs for competitive management level might be viewed more as problems than as parts of the solution. But it is part of the solution, and whether a company operates globally or is limited to smaller markets, sustainability is an important component. It's a key component of necessary for long-term profitability. To go sustainable today is a necessity to be competitive and profitable in 10 years' time, given the pace with which climate change and also biodiversity is taking place at the moment. So at the end of the day, sustainable business is also profitable business, we like to think. I'll stop there, and looking forward to listen to our speakers, to learn more about the different perspectives, and certainly to listen to Dr. Radu from Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a very good introduction. Thank you for setting the scene. And thank you very much to tell us a little bit about Raoul Wallenberg. Excellent. So now let's kickstart our first session, titled Business and Human Rights, Global, Regional, and Malaysia Perspectives. The first speaker for the session number 1 is Dr. Radu Mahrez, who is the Acting Research Director, Associate Professor, Head of Economic Globalization and Human Rights Thematic Area at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Dr. Mahrez is specialized in the area of business and human rights with a focus on multinational enterprises and global supply chain. His work combines transnational law, corporate governance, and corporate social responsibility perspectives. Dr. Mahrez will share with us the global perspective on human rights in business, an update on the regulatory developments. So, Dr. Mahrez, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Ambassador, for introducing this interesting webinar. I'm so pleased to join you. And I will address in 10 minutes the topic that was given to me and share a PowerPoint with you. I promise there will be only a few slides. Can you see it, Roberto? I hope it works. And
yes, we can see that you may want to project the slide, but we can see the slide, yes. Okay,
excellent, thank you. And as I try to bring you up to speed, perhaps if you don't know all these developments, I will talk about global regulatory developments in the area of business and human rights. And I will focus on 2 things, new regulations on multinational enterprises and their global supply chains. And the second thing is regional, mega regional trade and investment agreements. And as I will talk about these 2 issues, I chose to speak about waves of development, just to convey the image that change is accelerating in this area. In the last 10 years, we have seen successive waves of regulations and policies that affect multinational enterprises. So with this, I hope to give you a sense about how things have developed in the business and human rights area, how one thing is leading to another. And my key point will be that the problems of human rights protection, labor protection, environmental protection are very serious, and they remain very serious. But they are being met, I argue, by an unprecedented amount of international and national laws and policies. So the international regulatory landscape is changing very fast, and some states have become very active in this area. That's another way of saying that gone are the days when states considered that the impacts of trade and investment are to be handled by states through national laws and by multinational enterprises through corporate voluntarism, through CSR. Things have changed dramatically since then. It's a very dynamic and fast-moving picture. One of the defining moments has been the tragedy in Bangladesh in the garment sector, the Rana Plaza disaster, where over 1,000 people perished in 2013. That has accelerated some of the regulatory developments that I will mention. And talking now about my first point about how the regulations of multinational enterprises are changing, I would draw your attention primarily to four waves. Starting from the very soft, the less demanding one, and as you see, accelerating down through hard laws, through legally binding instruments. And maybe give you a few examples so you have some reference points with dates, how things have been moving. If you look at international soft law, which is not treaties, is not legally binding on states or on transnational companies, we have lots of guidance on CSR, on business and human rights. Perhaps the leading instrument here is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 2011. You are probably already familiar with it. It established the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, meaning to act with due diligence, the idea of human rights due diligence. Also, the UN SDGs refer to the role of the private sector. It's emphasized very clearly. Now, the UN Guiding Principles have become the reference point in this area. It's the normative statement. It's well known and supported by many stakeholders, including businesses. The second wave that started again around 2010, it's at national level. Some of the large industrial economies, the states have adopted transparency laws that require multinationals to report about their policies, the impacts and the systems they have in place to address human rights, labor rights, environmental problems, anti-corruption as well. So perhaps the leading document here, if you are interested, would come from the European Union, is the Directive on Non-Financial Reporting adopted in 2014. But primarily it has been the US and the EU, Canada, Australia that have adopted this type of laws. Still, civil society groups draw attention that just reporting doesn't really change business conduct. Perhaps it does, but it is not a forceful way of producing change. And therefore, the third wave of regulations is appearing now, starting with 2017. And this is the due diligence laws. France has been the pioneer here, the first state to adopt a due diligence law. They call it the duty of vigilance. And that has been followed in the EU by Netherlands, and the European Union announced just last year, took everybody by surprise, announcing that very soon, probably next year, the EU will adopt a directive on human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence. So that will be mandatory. It will not be voluntary. All the probably the larger European companies in all 27 member states will have to turn this directive into national law. So to adopt due diligence systems will become a legal obligation in the European Union, and that will have transnational effects through the global supply chains. And perhaps the last wave, which is not here yet, perhaps it will never appear, we do not know, but it's basically making parent companies, the multinational companies themselves, liable for what is happening in the supply chains. So for example, victims of abuse could turn to the parent companies for reparations and for further measures. So this is a bridge too far for the time being. The most interesting development to watch here is the UN Treaty on Business and Human Rights. As you know, it has been negotiated in the United Nations since 2014. We have now 3 drafts in the last 3 years. There have been improved drafts, and there you will find the references both to mandatory due diligence, meaning wave 3, but there are states that actually think there should be even stronger provisions that more or less hint to wave 4. But this is a long-term process. It's not gonna end soon, and it's up to negotiations, so we have to see where things will end there. So I think this gives you a rough idea about what happened in the last 10 years and the evolution from a weaker, if you want, soft law standards to what is becoming mandatory legal obligations that increase protection of human rights, protection of environment throughout global supply chains. Which brings me to a parallel development. It's also something rather recent, and it happens in the area of trade and investment agreements. So these are treaties negotiated and concluded by states. And one of the key questions here is whether economic liberalization, facilitation of trade and investment should be linked or not with the environmental protection and with labor protection. Should there be a link or not? And here you see developments making the link and some that still do not make the link. And here we have some agreements. Malaysia is part to the first one, the CPTPP, concluded in 2018. It covers countries around the Pacific Rim, not China. And there you have specific chapters talking about workers' rights and environmental protection, as well as direct references to corporate social responsibilities. Very recently, the EU and China concluded an investment agreement. Again, it has these references to CSR and labor and environmental chapters. And in the US, in the North American region, the NAFTA has been renegotiated during President Trump's period. And we have this new agreement, the USMCA, which again has stronger labor protections than NAFTA used to have. But there is also developments along more classical economic liberalization, and the RCEP is one example. It's concluded by the ASEAN states with China as well and other countries in the region. And there you will see there are no references to workers' rights and environmental protection, not this type of chapters that I mentioned before. And this is the more classical approach, getting focused on economic liberalization, removing barriers and increasing flows of trade, investment, and capital in the region. And this has been also the classic approach of the World Trade Organization, which you remember doesn't have labor provisions, and it's quite little on environmental protection. So back to this question of how should we look at this link? Does it represent a commitment to free and fair trade, or is it protectionism in disguise? It's the perennial question, but here I would want to draw your attention to the new trade policy adopted by the European Union just last month in February this year. And it's a remarkable development because it maintains the EU's commitment to value-based trade. But as a difference from the previous 2015 strategy, the EU tries to be much more assertive. So there are stronger provisions, including on labor rights and the enforcement of these labor chapters. And as you will read this document, you will see that it's part of a bigger game where the European Union is developing and trying to push a new model of doing business. It's nothing less than that. It's a new model of doing business more sustainably. And these regulations that I mentioned of transnationals, as well as these trade and investment agreements, are two sides of the same coin. They are tools that the EU is using to promote this new model. And as I mentioned, this is going to have international effects. The EU market is quite large, and it will affect the global value chains. And with this, I would want to conclude, just to maybe summarize and say that what Professor John Ruggie, the drafter of the UN Guiding Principles, had in mind was the guiding principles being supported by states through a smart mix of measures, laws, policies, all kinds of other incentives. And I think what I showed you before is kind of proving that he was right, and this smart mix of measures is emerging. Global supply chains clearly are affected by geopolitical changes. I mean, you are following what is happening. And this is something that both these developments, the laws, but also the geopolitical and economic changes are clearly impacting the environment where businesses define their strategies, understand their responsibilities, and play their roles in sustainable development. So with this, I would like to conclude and to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahrez. It's been a very useful opening, a very useful overview. But let me ask you, before we move to the next presentation, let me ask you this question very quickly. Do you think this laws and regulatory frameworks that you have mentioned during your presentation have actually worked in practice so far? So if you had to make an assessment of what has worked and what hasn't worked, how would you respond to that?
I guess that's the most important question, not only for lawyers, but everybody interested in human rights protection and environmental protection. It's no point having laws if they're not implemented, or if they don't lead to practical impacts. I listed many of them. I would say the guiding principles have been influential looking back at the last 10 years. They have anticipated many things. They have changed the discussions. The laws that have been adopted, whether the trade and investment agreements or the laws on multinational companies, they have been weak in the beginning, so the effects have been modest, but they started a process of change. And if you see the EU decision to adopt a directive on human rights due diligence, they clearly explain why they do it, because transparency directive from 2014 didn't change conduct enough. So the quality and quantity of reports has not been sufficient. The level playing field for companies that comply, the playing field is not level. And there are both human rights as well as business reasons, as well as political reasons to strengthen the laws. The same you see it in the free trade agreements that the EU is concluding. Notoriously, they have been weak in the meaning that they were not backed by trade sanctions. The way to implement them was through consultation and panels of experts that would look at concrete cases. But this is changing too, and the EU last year has set up new structures and reviewed the work these trade agreements have worked, including the labor chapters and environmental chapters. So I would say the picture is clearly one of strengthening. There is awareness that there needs to be strengthened enforcement, stronger provision, and clearly there is a trend in that direction. So I think that's a short way of answering the question of impact.
It's a positive outlook. So thank you very much for this very important insights. And stay with us, Dr. Mahrez, if you can, until the end. And there will be, as I said, a Q&A session. The next speaker today, ladies and gentlemen, is Ms. Anisha Rajapaksa, Director of Shareholder Engagement at the Fair Labor Alliance. Anisha is a senior global expert with 2 decades of progressive experience working at the intersection of human rights, business and international development. And through her work at the Fair Labor Alliance, Anisha supports companies to ethically recruit and manage workforces and mitigate risk of illegal and unethical exploitation. Anisha will share with us her insights on business and human rights in Asia, challenges and opportunity. So without further ado, Anisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto, for that kind introduction. And thank you, RWI and BCSD, for this opportunity to share my thoughts on business and human rights in Asia, and especially actually in the wake of the pandemic. So today, as all of you know, we are living in a time of unraveling crisis, as most of us are seeing the human and economic cost of COVID-19 is severe, and that no nation has escaped the resulting widespread disruption. Literally overnight, the pandemic caused companies to have to make huge changes on how they operate. At the same time, the increasing media focus on vulnerabilities in global supply chains and the need to build back better has helped raise awareness of businesses and human rights challenges faced by workers and communities in the region and beyond. According to recent ILO estimates, globally, the lockdown measures led to the loss of 495 million full-time jobs in the second quarter of 2020 and 245 million jobs lost in the last quarter. The pandemic has also in many cases caused a global demand downturn, and this actually has sadly created an excuse for many governments and even businesses to lower their human rights standards. The Cambodian government workers protest against unpaid wages, the Indonesian government prioritizing of business interests over labor and environmental rights, employers taking advantage of the COVID crisis to unlawfully dismiss their migrant workforce and to withhold the wages and benefits that are owed to them are just a few of the rights violations that have been taking place. Over in South Asia, in Bangladesh, local garment manufacturers were left with a loss of 5 billion euros as clothing brands slashed or postponed orders and generally absconded on contract commitments. 348 factories were forced to close between April and May 2020, and more than 1 million people were left without livelihoods. COVID-19 shed light on how countries treat migrant workers, despite their significant economic contribution. Inadequate housing and other deficiencies have worsened COVID-19 infections among migrant workers in Singapore. And their neglect and their appalling living conditions actually was the main reason for the massive spike in cases. However, even in the midst of the raging pandemic, some progressive companies actually have pressed on to stay focused on the environmental challenges while protecting their workers and trying to mitigate the climate and biodiversity crisis and social crisis raging around us. In June 2020, Unilever introduced a regenerative agriculture code for all suppliers, plus a 1 billion euro fund for climate and nature-related investments. Among other measures, US retailer Walmart also released a series of its own ambitious sustainability targets in which regenerative supply chains figure highly. Another notable recent example is the Forest Positive Coalition of Action launched by the Consumer Goods Forum last year. The initiative includes Mars, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, and Carrefour among its 17 members and sets out to eliminate deforestation once and for all from controversial commodity supply chains such as palm oil and soy. What's important about this initiative is that of the 4 main areas of action, engaging with suppliers is number 1. Global markets are increasingly aware also of the importance of human rights in economic activities, and some countries have imposed trade sanctions on those committing widespread human rights violations. This hits home to Malaysia as the world's second largest palm oil producer, supplying to many global brands around the world. Malaysia relies on over 337,000 migrant workers from countries such as Indonesia, India, and Bangladesh to harvest palm fruit. And as many of you know already, palm oil companies and other companies in Malaysia are bound by the global market and other local regulatory requirements to disclose their commitments to addressing human rights issues. At the end of last year, FGV and Sime Darby plantations, two of the world's largest palm oil producers, were banned by the US Customs and Border Protection over the alleged use of forced labor during production. Shortly thereafter, major oil buyers, including US food company General Mills, are seeking to block both from their global supply chain and even issued no-buy orders. This, as you can imagine, is a huge blow to Malaysian palm oil, which has long had the reputation as being more sustainable compared to its bigger rival, Indonesia. Last year, the US also banned the import of surgical gloves from two subsidiaries of Malaysia's Top Glove, the world's biggest manufacturer of the product, over forced labor concerns, including debt bondage, excessive overtime, retention of identification documents, and abusive working and living conditions. Southeast Asia is also known for its alarming suppression of human rights defenders. Since 2015, over 400 defenders had been subjected to threats, intimidation, attacks, and killings, majority being environmental defenders who were defending land rights. Human rights defenders are not necessarily against businesses as often portrayed. They support responsible businesses and are often a willing interface between the company and the communities. If 2020 was a reminder that anything can happen, 2021 is really a good time to prepare to face it. So what can businesses do to stay ahead of the curve? The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, adopted in 2011, that Radu spoke about, created consensus that the bottom line should be that companies must not harm people or communities. This means that they should take proactive and clear measures to avoid being involved in negative human rights impacts and work at putting things right when their actions cause any rights violations. Today, 10 years on, human rights is regarded as a key performance indicator for most companies all over the world. Other leading global standards, such as the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct, as frameworks, can help companies embed human rights into business operations. The guiding principles in particular have helped identify and articulate a global consensus on human rights that both states and business enterprises can integrate into their operations. Although Southeast Asia was a region lagging behind others in terms of developing awareness of how business impacts on human rights, in recent times there are clear signs that there is a renewed impetus on the states to move the business and human rights agenda forward. Companies are facing increasing pressure to engage with human rights challenges from other governments, investors, international brands, companies, the media, and from workers and consumers. A number of governments in the Asia-Pacific region have developed or are in the process of developing national action plans on business and human rights. In October 2019, Thailand became the first country in the Asia-Pacific to publish a standalone NAP on business and human rights. It was followed by Japan, which published a national action plan in October 2020. In August 2018, South Korea published a NAP on the promotion and protection of human rights, which includes a chapter on business and human rights. India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Mongolia, Pakistan are also in the process of developing a NAP. There are also some non-state initiatives to promote a business and human rights agenda through activities such as trainings for companies. There have also been notable efforts in the region to address business and human rights challenges, including environmental protection, through organizations such as the Rainforest Alliance, UN Global Compact, local networks in Asia of UN Global Compact, the ASEAN CSR Network, the Business Council for Sustainable Development in Malaysia, ICEAL, and the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, among others. And organizations such as the one that I'm representing, the Fair Labor Alliance, that works with businesses to identify and remedy poor labor practices in their supply chains. It's also worth reflecting on the fact that companies operating or based in South Asia have been looking at social and environmental considerations for some time, although they may not always use the term human rights and may not always feel comfortable doing so. The terminology may not be conducive, for example, when engaging with some governments, and may need to be rephrased into terms such as responsible business practices or sustainable business. In some cases, there may be a strong rationale for translating human rights explicitly to help deepen approaches and connect to external expectations. Either way, human rights offers business leaders objective and universal ways of engaging with and ways of embedding human rights into business practices. There are plans declarations, agreements, statements, and other documents with all the politically correct intentions and aspirations, such as the code that ARIBA, ASEAN Responsible and Inclusive Business Alliance, is promoting, drawn from the SDGs, the G20 Inclusive Business Framework, ASEAN's own Human Rights Declaration, its CSR guidelines on labor, the ASEAN Consensus on the Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers. There is an influx of good and right words. These refer to ASEAN as people-centered, people-orientated, inclusive, equitable, sustainable. But what is the reality on the ground? So where are we today, despite all these well-intentioned calls to good and responsible and inclusive practices? Clearly, there has not been satisfactory progress and much more has to be done. Why are there such wide gaps? If we really think about it, I would say that the gap in this region, as in most other regions actually, is between the rhetoric and the actual implementation on the ground. And in most cases, weak political will, governance, and corruption. I know that this is easier said than done, but this has to change. Governments have to lead by example and create a level playing field for businesses. While businesses need to be profitable to survive and thrive, it must be done by doing the right thing, by respecting people and the planet, by ethical behavior, by respecting human rights and stakeholder interests, and by being transparent and accountable. Human rights needs to find a permanent place in the boardroom. This means addressing the economic and social inequalities resulting from flawed business practices. While the guiding principles have done much to catalyze action, gaps and challenges remain. A key challenge is how to drive responsible business to conduct deeper into supply chains and engage more companies, including SMEs. Today, we are witnessing a global trend towards mandatory human rights due diligence. As Radu explained, the European Commissioner of Justice has committed to introduce mandatory due diligence legislation into the European Parliament very shortly. And these proposed laws will have a wide scope with the potential to apply to non-EU-based companies and contain sanctions for non-compliance. Similar laws are underway in several European countries. For example, in Germany last month, the government agreed on a national mandatory due diligence law that fines companies procuring parts or material abroad from suppliers who fail to meet minimum human rights and environmental standards. These developments are likely to affect businesses in Southeast Asia, both those that are doing business with the West and those that are part of global value chains. Ensuring that human rights are integrated into business planning will also be critical into the success of building forward better from the COVID pandemic. Businesses, civil society, or governments cannot do what is needed on its own. Effective human rights due diligence is grounded in stakeholder engagement. Right holders provide information that enables companies to understand their human rights risk by raising concerns about actual and potential impacts and by providing input about how best they can be addressed and also remediated. And with this information, companies are able to find out where the greatest risk might be and then make targeted and strategic decisions about what actions to take. Related to stakeholder engagement is the importance of collective action, especially to address systemic issues. A company might identify certain human rights risks through its due diligence, but to address and mitigate those risks deep down in the supply chain might be very challenging as an individual company. Therefore, partnering and developing collaboration between companies, governments, and other stakeholders will be much more effective to sustainably address these risks. So the Southeast Asia region has an opportunity through its recovery from this pandemic to take steps towards a new normal that is more inclusive, human rights focused, sustainable, and resilient, while safeguarding the planet's natural systems. So if we are to usher a new era in responsible and inclusive business, we have to make the term build back better meaningful rather than just a nice sounding alliteration. Perhaps less building back and more of moving forward differently. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Anisha. That was a very comprehensive overview. And I think it stresses the importance of creating awareness. And this is what this type of event is doing and wants to do. This is our objective. And I think as company become more aware of the situation and also the risks of non-compliance, then I think positive action is to be expected. And this is something that we honestly hope. I have a question for you just before we move to the next speaker. And it's about stakeholders engagement. So companies see a significant value in working collectively to address human rights challenges, especially within the supply chains. So how important is, in your view, stakeholder engagement in preventing the adverse impact of business activities on human rights and the environment?
Thanks, Roberto, for this question. So I really believe that for any progressive business, building networks with a wider range of stakeholders is important. As I mentioned earlier, businesses cannot go at it alone. And relationship with civil society can be a key part in building an understanding and awareness of where human rights risks might be at and how they can be addressed, remedied in relation to business activities. So building networks with other stakeholders, that includes governments, trade unions, industry associations, the media, the UN, academics, and even human rights defenders, is an interesting way some businesses are gathering intelligence and supporting their due diligence processes. And seeing businesses sit down with civil society organizations or human rights defenders to talk about human rights is a development that was rare about 10 years ago. But today, smart businesses are doing just that. They realize that actually there's a mutual benefit of such engagements, to be deliberately and genuinely moving from being adversarial to a far more collaborative approach. So companies that are working more closely together in initiatives to better address the complex supply chain issues actually are able to find potential long-term solutions. And many businesses now understand the power of leveraging their collective strengths, even to influence policy.
Thank you very much, Nisha. So extremely useful overview. You've depicted the challenges in Asia extremely well. So let's move to the next speaker for today, ladies and gentlemen, who is Mr. Edmund Bon. Is head of chambers, civil, at Amber Bon Advocates in KL, in Kuala Lumpur. Edmund has been an advocate and solicitor for more than 20 years. He advises corporations, governmental and non-governmental organizations on a range of legal issues. He was the former chairperson of the Bar Council's Human Rights Committee and represented Malaysia on the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Edmund will share with us the Malaysian perspective, extremely important, and he will tell us about the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. Edmund, thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, BCSD, for this invitation. I have 10 minutes and I'll do two things. I have a few slides. What I'll do is just to explain where we are on Malaysia's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And then just touch upon two laws that are currently in place regarding sustainability reporting and how that will be impacted if the NAP goes through. If I just share my screen, can you see this? Can everyone see this?
It's coming. Okay, now you can project the slides.
Yes.
Excellent.
So the Malaysian government in 2019 had agreed, initiated and declared that it was going to embark on a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. This was after many years of lobbying, and Suhakam had in 2015 come up with a strategic framework on the National Action Plan. So I think this was a success in terms of the first step government is supposed to take in embarking on the National Action Plan. We assisted the government to organize it and to provide technical assistance. We had a very good turnout, and I think it was very enthusiastically received by CSOs and businesses. That was 2019, and this was announced by the late Dato' Wee Kee Lew, who was in charge of legal and parliamentary affairs. So currently, the National Action Plan is going to be led by BAYU, which is the Legal Affairs Department in the Prime Minister's Department. What is a National Action Plan? A National Action Plan is basically a strategic policy plan that the state is supposed to implement to look at how adverse human rights impacts on business can be mitigated or reduced. And it must be in conformity with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The key features of a National Action Plan are quite numerous. I've chosen a few. One size doesn't fit every country. It must be transparent, it must be inclusive, there must be a multi-stakeholder approach, it must be based on human rights, it must have smart principles, it is government-led, and it needs to be owned by businesses, CSOs, and people in general. And it also looks at how we can coordinate and have coherence among different governments and different government agencies, that's multi-sectorial, and different non-government actors. So how is National Action Plan Business Human Rights formulated? When I was at the ICHA, we were touring ASEAN and trying to get countries and governments to commit towards setting up a National Action Plan for Business and Human Rights. And there is some guidance by the OHCHR and the UN as to how it is set up. This will provide us a framework, and this is perhaps the framework that government will likely take. And this is something that we can prepare for, because by the time the NAP is implemented, things may be so drastic that companies may not have the capacity or time to change. So my encouragement would be to start looking at it now, and where changes can be made incrementally, that should start now. So there are a few phases. The first phase is the initiation phase, and that I mentioned was in June 2019. Then now the government sets up a steering committee to start on having consultations to come up with what is called an NBA, a National Baseline Assessment, on the particular issue that government wishes to look into or include in the NAP. After that phase, there will be drafting of the initial National Action Plan, which is a zero draft. And then on that zero draft, that discussion will happen, that it will include eliciting public feedback. And this was very contentious in Thailand. So we use Thailand as an example because it's the only Southeast Asian country that has published a standalone NAP. Indonesia has one by its Human Rights Commission, but not by the government. And Malaysia is supposed to have come up with ours in 2020, or the process, but we have slowed down, I think, because of the political changes in the country. So after phase 4, what we will do is, what the government will do is they will improve on the NAP and then adopt the NAP. And then there will be a process of monitoring and implementing the NAP. And then at the 7th phase, if the first NAP is, for example, 5 years, there needs to be an update to the 5-year first NAP. In the first phase, and I think this is where we are at now by government, is that the government will be the government, I think, has established a steering committee. The steering committee will be the one that steers the development of the NAP and makes the policy decisions. There will be a secretariat, and the secretariat for government will be the Legal Affairs Division. There will be terms of reference. All these have not been made public, but these are the steps that we understand will be taken by government. And the steering committee will be represented by key stakeholders around government, around NGOs, as well as business corporations. So that phase 1 at the moment has not really kicked off. It is still in that process, and I expect government to make some announcements very soon, because what they did was in December in 2020, the government had done 3 online consultations on what we think are the 3 priority areas that they will be looking at: labor, governance, and the environment. So we can expect that at least these 3 areas, labor, governance, and environment, will be matters that we tackle in the NAP. Of course, the NAP can tackle a host of other issues, but I think the Malaysian government will be focusing only on these 3. And these 3 is large enough. Labor and governance has a lot of laws that are already in place, environment not as much. And therefore, I think these 3 areas where companies will be extremely impacted. And this is where I think the meeting point between NGOs, the meeting point between human rights advocates and corporations has to find its level. The NBA, as I mentioned, is to obtain information as to what the problems are related to business impacts on human rights, and it will look at what gaps. It will include consultations from Suhakam and affected communities. So after the national baseline assessment, I'm not going to go through all this, but after that there will be a 0 draft NAP, and as I mentioned, it will then be shared, and there will be consultations. There will be, I'm not going to go through all this because I only have 10 minutes, but I'm going to say that, as I've shown in the steps, the different 7 phases, you will see a NAP that goes through maybe 2 or 3 years of refinement, 2 or 3 years of consultations, and it is supposed to be a strategic plan that government is going to implement. Some of these measures, like the one in Thailand, are voluntary, and that was why the NAP in Thailand was criticized quite heavily, because a lot of the measures in the NAP in Thailand are voluntary. In Malaysia, we would of course say that we have already many laws in place, and therefore having voluntary measures in Malaysia's NAP is not enough. We should go higher than what we have in our laws already. And this is where I come to my second point. How have we, or in Malaysia, tried to implement reporting in terms of trying to align corporations' practices on human rights and sustainability? There have been 2 laws that have come in. One is the Section 2533 of the Companies Act, which introduced the business review report. And this is a voluntary measure where directors can include a BRR in its report, and not many companies do that. For the listed companies in Bursa, there is a sustainability statement that is mandatory, and we see that because it's mandatory, a lot of companies have done that to include such statements in their annual reports. So these are 2 measures that have been taken in Malaysia in terms of the compliance framework. So on the first, there is a 2017 guideline where the BRR would have information regarding environmental matters, labor issues, community and social issues. Effectiveness and impact is unverified, but it is a good first step by the Companies Commission to introduce it as a voluntary measure. We have not had evidence-based research to see how many reports have included the BRR. We do not see many, and we think that there is a lot of room for improvement in this area. On related listed companies, the sustainability statements require a narrative of the material, economic, environmental, and social risks and opportunities, discussion as to what governance structure has been put in place to manage the EES risks. And these EES risks must be material in the sense that they reflect significant EES impacts, or they will influence assessment and decisions of stakeholders, including shareholders. So this is mandatory. And EES, as I mentioned just now, economic conditions, such as procurement policies, community impacts. There's also things on ecosystems, water emissions, energy, and as would be social systems and social impact on communities. This sustainability statements, I think, again, is a good first step, especially because it's mandatory. But what is lacking, I think, in Malaysia, as we have looked at, generally, Malaysia's companies, many of the Malaysian public listed companies do not find themselves on indexes such as Dow Jones or FTSE indexes on sustainability. So I think many companies seem to be quite content and quite competent in making sustainability statements to Bursa because they are mandatory. But I think the next challenge and the next step would probably be to go a bit more global, because those standards there will be, I think, higher. There was research done in 2019 in terms of reporting, and Malaysia came in quite well, second after Thailand. This research showed that there is a strong relationship between how much is being reported, the quality of reporting, and how much the country demands in terms of compliance on the reporting. Meaning, if there's a law that says, please report on A, B, C, D, E, F, G, companies will do and will follow it more. And where countries don't have that kind of law, less definite law, there will be less quality reporting. This study summarizes basically what I think human rights advocates would be arguing for, that the NAP in Malaysia has to have greater compliance force. It needs to be made into law. And I think that's the big challenge corporations will be facing. There is a big challenge CSOs will be facing as well in trying to get those compliance issues mandatory and in law. As I mentioned just now, if it's just voluntary, NAP really in Malaysia will be a good start, will be a good awareness building process, but it may be a waste of time. Again, in terms of human rights, in terms of the UNGP disclosure, the report showed Malaysia was quite good in Southeast Asia out of the 5 countries that were reviewed, because other countries don't even have that kind of information. And so we come close second after Thailand. But the critique, and I've put that down, is that there is insufficient information for stakeholders to assess performance. Operational details of compliance are lacking. Reports are usually outsourced to consultants, which may not reflect what is happening on the ground. There is, of course, insufficient multi-stakeholder discussions that is inclusive before the reports are written. Reports are unaudited by third parties. I think in other countries, especially in Europe now, there are discussions whether CSOs, NGOs should be allowed to audit some of these reports. And that's why we see violations still being exposed through whistleblowers or through media exposures. And we will always have that if there is no meeting of minds, or there's no trying to find the same level where NGOs are not, or human rights defenders are not denigrated. Rather, the companies have a genuine and sincere discussion with to deal with the complaints that come before them. Yeah, that's all I have, Roberto, for the moment. It may be a lot of information, and that's why I wanted to stop.
No, thank you very much, Edmund, and thank you very much for giving us an update on the National Action Plan. In a very short statement, before we move on to the next part of the program, give me your gut feeling, your personal view on how you see the future for business and human rights developing in Malaysia. I mean, apart from the National Action Plan, tell me about your feeling. Will the companies, the corporations follow through, or what's your idea there?
Yeah, I think there are a few points. Dr. Radu has showed how things have developed. And the Business and Human Rights Treaty that's going on is something that's very important. So what we are saying is, number one, let's embrace it. Let's deal with the issues now before things become so mandatory that there's no room even for discussion. So it's early time, it's early days, so companies can start dealing with it. I think the second point is there's more exposures on companies that are bigger because there's a lot of media publicity, but the problems with compliance also comes through in smaller companies, SMEs, who don't have the capacity to comply with business and human rights. How do we deal with that? And number three, the devil are in the details. I think there is insufficient assistance provided to companies in how they are to remediate, what the standards are to be applied when they are trying to solve the issues. So the know-how and the technical knowledge at the micro level is missing in Malaysia, and that's what we see in the advocacy that's happening.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. It's a process, and but we need to start it. And I think something has already been done, and there are promising things happening in the future. So thank you very much, Edmund, for your presentation and for your very valuable contribution. It was indeed a very interesting discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, we now take a 5-minute coffee refill or leg stretching break. Literally 4 or 5 minutes at the most, and then we move on to session 2. Welcome back, everyone. As I said, please make yourself comfortable as we are heading to the next session. So session 2 will be focusing on corporate responsibility in the respect and remedy of human rights and the environment. The first speaker for session 2 is Ms. Cynthia Ann Peterson from our member company Petronas. Cynthia is the principal of social performance at Petronas at group level. So not just in Malaysia, but for the group. Cynthia has been in the energy industry for over a decade with international experience in managing social risks across the life cycle of the upstream and downstream business. Cynthia also has experience in developing sustainability strategy and sustainability reporting. Cynthia will share with us the challenges and opportunities in the oil and gas sector. Cynthia, are you with us?
Hi, Roberto. Yes.
The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed the session so far. It's been really illuminating for me as well. So I'd just like to spend this 10 minutes that I have talking about basically 3 observations that I'd like to make regarding this very important topic of the pillars of respect and remedy related to human rights and the environment. So the first point I'd like to make is that, respect for human rights is the foundation for sustainability. It's not possible to achieve sustainability without respecting the rights of people. And you see the thread of human rights all throughout the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They were sort of tacitly present in the previous Millennium Development Goals. But I think now the point has been made a little bit more forcefully that, human rights is one of the driving factors of sustainability. Now, in our sector, the energy sector, risk management is one of the cornerstones of how we do business. And really, to respect rights of people, ensuring that they're not harmed, ensuring that everyone goes home safe is one of the key pillars. So, from the industry, risk management, the sharing of best practices within the industry and with across sectors, as well as collaborating with our stakeholders, among ourselves, with our partners. These are some of the things in which the industry has done to really drive home the pillar of respect for human rights. Because in 2011, when the United Nations, launched the guiding principles, it really created a lot of clarity. And I think our sector has really embraced the guiding principles and made it part of how we do business. So from a Petronas perspective, we are a global company, and we have really aligned our processes with the UN guiding principles, starting with a human rights commitment, which is a public document. You can see it on our website. We have a human rights report, which is also a public document. You can also see that on our website. We have a slew of management processes, risk management, to basically incorporate all the expectations of respect. So from, a top-down policy perspective to an access to remedy, utilizing grievance mechanisms across our business, not just for communities, but for employees as well as for contractors. So the second point I'd like to make is that, with sustainability and the drive towards, going net zero carbon for many of our colleagues and, within our industry, it has really illustrated the interconnectivity and complexity of human rights and environmental issues. It's now quite difficult to always, I would say it's now quite difficult to always separate human rights from the environmental issues because they're often intertwined. So, the challenges are numerous, as the world goes towards these sustainability goals. And the challenges in Malaysia are also numerous. We're also seeing some strengthening of the regulatory environment. For example, last year we saw the revision of Act 446, which is related to labor. We've seen societal expectations grow, with social media and all the avenues that people have, and just greater awareness among people, especially the younger people. You do see expectations growing and pressure put on businesses to respond. There was a discussion about disclosure in the previous presentation, and yes, it's true. Disclosure expectations have also grown, not just in Malaysia, but globally. So for companies that have a global footprint, basically you'll be seeing a lot of disclosure expectations from different jurisdictions and all asking about environmental, social, and governance. And they're not often asking them in isolation. So, the expectations of for companies to really respond to these calls for greater transparency and disclosure is definitely one of the highlights and drivers, and kind of underscores the whole importance of sustainability, especially in Malaysia today. So the third thing I'd like to say is that building back better is achievable. So COVID-19 has really highlighted a lot of gaps in processes. In Malaysia, one of the things that as industries that we need to discuss is the impact that COVID-19 has had on human rights, and how the narrative of it's either human rights or company survivability, that narrative needs to be challenged, and we need to help each other to build back better. I mean, there's a lot of good practices among the industry that we have, even within Malaysia, that we can share. So even if it's cross-sectoral, there are some perennial issues that are there that we can work together with, so that Malaysia overall can raise its standards on sustainability. I'd just like to wrap up my short discussion on the fact that respect really is good for business. I think in the opening remarks we heard that, and it's definitely true. Respect for human rights definitely is good for business because it helps us to manage our risks better. It helps us to be more sustainable in the way we develop our portfolios. It also helps to attract good talent towards companies, which is important because Malaysia is part of the global value chain, and with the growing legislation in different parts of the world on mandatory human rights due diligence, for example, or the UNGP Plus that's now being discussed. These issues do affect the way we do business in Malaysia. They're not something that happens, in the West and doesn't affect us at all, because we're part of the value chain. So, it's important to look at human rights and, other related issues such as the environment more holistically. And this is how, when we use respect for human rights as a driving factor for how we do business, it really promotes more sustainable business growth. So yeah, with that, I'd just like to stop here and happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. We move, if you don't mind, to the next presentation, the last one, and then we take a few questions. I think we are a little bit pushed for time. So yeah, last but definitely not least, today, ladies and gentlemen, we have Puan Nurul Asana Ahmed from FGV Holdings. Nurul has 17 years experience in human rights law and policy development. Nurul was with the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, SWACAM, for 15 years. She was head of the Research and Policy Development Division and later appointed as the Deputy Secretary of the Policy and Law Working Group in 2015. Nurul was the Senior Manager for the PALM program on environment, social and human rights at the Earthworm Foundation, formerly known as the Forest Trust. Currently, Nurul is the head of group sustainability at FGV Holdings. Nurul, the floor is yours, and then we will have some questions. Thank you very much for being with us, by the way.
Thank you, Roberto, for that introduction, and thank you, BSCD, and also RWI for inviting FGV to this webinar. So what I'll be sharing is basically on how FGV as a company, farm industry company, conduct our business in ensuring that we comply, respect human rights and also environmental rights. I hear loud and clear, the issues surrounding business operations in ensuring that our operation, is ethical and in line with applicable laws. Human rights laws, environmental laws are critical in ensuring marketability of our product as well. So it's not news for FGV that we have been under the radar internationally and also nationally with regard to how we do our business operation. So perhaps I can start by also highlighting that for FGV, since 2019, we have a renewed commitment to ensure that our operation comply and respect human rights. So our group sustainability policy has been enhanced twice since 2019. Again, we enhanced it in 2020 to ensure that our commitment to respect human rights, in particular labor rights, is second to none. And what we have also realized for FGV with regard to respecting human rights is that, and I hear this from our earlier speaker, Anisha talked about it quite aptly, that company cannot do this alone. We need support and we need also engagement with other stakeholders. So in ensuring, FGV's commitment and we deliver our commitment with regard to respecting human rights, underpinning our commitment is of course the international, documents such as UDHR, United Nations on guiding principles on business and human rights. And in ensuring we stay true to all this commitment, we work closely with a number of organizations, social and human rights organizations, internationally and also locally. At the moment, for our labor program in FGV, we are currently working with a Fair Labor Association. It's not Fair Labor Alliance, just to make sure that everyone in this room is clear. It's Fair Labor Association, an international organization based in Washington, to help FGV to identify the gaps and where the areas that we need to further strengthen, our labor practices to ensure that, you know, the rights of our migrant workers are protected. And I'm happy to report that, you know, so far, we have identified the gap, you know, from the recruitment process up to the retention process when they are working with us, and in ensuring their safe return to the home countries. So we have, through this collaboration with FLA and also the Naganita, another partner is the Naganita national or local partner. We have strengthened our recruitment process in home country, where we require our recruitment agencies to comply with ethical recruitment process and to ensure that, you know, workers that are coming into FGV's operation understand the terms and conditions that they are coming into, and that they are not charged fees that FGV commit to pay. So these are very clear in our communications to the potential workers as well as to the recruitment agencies. So this is one of the many other aspects that we're currently working to improve, including on the matters relating to workers' housing, living condition. From 2019 up to now, FGV has spent about 350 million ringgit towards housing improvement for our workers. So these are some of the initiatives that we have in pipeline to ensure that, you know, the workers' rights, livelihood are protected. Also, if I can also share with regard to the other issue that we believe is, you know, plaguing the palm industry, is with regard to the issue of children in plantation. You know, for companies, you know, working in plantation, the presence of children in plantation is inevitable. So what we have done with regard to FGV is we have a clear policy that, you know, for our workers, there should be no one below the age of 18. But we also understand that, you know, parents working, especially with regard to Sabah, because we have a lot of family workers in Sabah. So what we have done is we have ensured that there are daycare facilities where children under certain age, schooling age, can you know, have the protection while the parents go to work. And we have also established in support, with the support from the Indonesian embassy, 11 community learning center for children, for children of our workers working in our plantation. So that are some of our, you know, commitment with regard to ensuring our operation respect human rights. I have a lot of other initiatives that I can share, but I would also want to touch a little bit about how FGV commit to also protect the environmental aspect. For FGV, we are also clear on our commitment with regard to the no deforestation, and I guess any plantation company can vouch that we are being monitored internationally and also nationally with regard to our deforestation activity, if any. So we cannot avoid, we cannot escape, because, you know, when you talk about deforestation, the satellite won't lie. So the satellite imagery is being used to monitor, you know, companies' commitment to no deforestation, and that's how for FGV so far we have not expanded our operation into forest area, but we are also cautious to the fact that, you know, we also have suppliers who may in some areas, you know, expand their operation into forest reserve or virgin forest. So we have also, you know, extended our commitment to ensure that our suppliers protect human rights, and as well as committed to no deforestation through our policy commitment and also our suppliers code of conduct. And I'm happy to share that with regard to our commitment to no deforestation, we have in fact suspended one supplier who we found, of course, through the help and information from our engagement with NGOs, stakeholders. We found that this company that supplied to us, in fact, expanded their operation or plantation area into what is formerly known as the forest reserve. So we have taken initiative to engage and communicate with the company to ensure that they remediate the area, but unfortunately, because we see there's no effort on their side, FGV has decided to suspend supply from this particular supplier. So that are some of the extent that we would go to ensure that FGV's operation is true to our commitment to no deforestation and no exploitation. And I know that for FGV, with the current ban by the US government with regard to allegations of our labor practices, we believe that we are currently working towards addressing all gaps. I'm not saying that we are saint. We are not perfect. No one is perfect. There are gaps, and we have identified these gaps with the help of this NGOs engagement, and we are remediating it. And we definitely will reach out to the US authorities, sooner to petition for a revocation of the ban. But of course, it will be done through the right process of ensuring that our operation are truly in compliance with all the international requirements. So I guess I will stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions on matters relating to FGV. Roberto, over to you.
Sure. And thank you very much. And, thank you very much for your presentation, for the information you shared with us. And one thing that comes to mind, and you touched upon that actually, how does a company like FGV ensures that the suppliers and your value chain partners are also moving in the same direction? You're moving along with you guys to meet the sustainability commitments. So practically, how do you make sure that you go along with the same shared objectives there?
Yeah. Thanks, Roberto, for that question. It's not easy, especially for a company like FGV, where our suppliers for fresh fruit bunch, we have about 70% of our fresh fruit bunch are supplied from externally. So only 30% is from our own production in FGV. So that's the more pressure on FGV to ensure that our suppliers comply with the commitment. So at the moment, what we have is we have strengthened our suppliers code of conduct in 2019-2020 to include, commitment and extend commitment to comply with human rights principles to our suppliers. But this is not enough. What we are currently doing is also validating our suppliers' practices on the ground, and this is where we are working with our another stakeholder, Malaysian Institute on supply chain management, and to understand and to validate the practice on the ground of our suppliers. So this will take time.
Okay.
But the moment we know that there are some issue, we engage with that particular suppliers to encourage transformation. And if they do not show any initiative or any commitment towards that, it will be the ultimate decision is to cut them from our.
You have to take action, of course,
yes.
Of course. Okay, thank you very much, Nurul. One question to you, Cynthia, and I will ask the panelists to be short and to the point because we only have a few minutes left. But it's important, for me to just clarify a couple of issues. Cynthia, what do you think are the main drivers for business for corporates for addressing human rights and the environmental issues?
But thanks for that question. I mean, the key driver really is coming back to the idea that, you know, respect for human rights is good for business. So with that in mind, for example, in our industry, we have a lot of risk management processes that enable us to identify issues and avoid them if possible, or mitigate them quickly, you know, if they occur. So this goes for both human rights as well as for environmental issues. And hence, you know, because in our sector, we believe in sustainability. I mean, although it's highly challenged, our sector, however, you know, things are changing, and you do see a shift of an alignment of businesses with their stakeholders and other parties, you know, in terms of moving towards more sustainable practices. So I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And Edmund, do you think NGOs and other associations in Malaysia can help and provide, for example, valuable feedback on the crafting or moving along this national action plan? And if so, what should we do to create that kind of exchange?
Yeah, I think
is that happening already, or is it not happening as it should? What's your opinion?
Thank you, Roberto. I think one of the key drivers of this BHR movement around the world has been CSOs. And in Malaysia, the CSOs are quite united on this. We understand the government has identified some CSOs to be on the steering committee. So I think that's quite a good inclusive approach. But secondly, I think there needs to be a change in how CSOs and human rights defenders are looked at in Malaysia, and in fact, in all over the world. If there are complaints, and some of these complaints are legitimate, some of them are illegitimate, I think the issue needs to be the discussion that happens rather than the accusations that happen and the counter accusations. So I wanted to mention something which I think is really important, but I think Malaysia will not accept at the moment. So when I was listening to Cynthia and Nurul, extraterritorial obligations for the work that happens outside of Malaysia is very important. We have seen cases of Malaysian companies committing alleged human rights violations outside Malaysia. And of course, under the labor governance environmental themes, if ETOs come into play it's to be mandatory through the net. CSOs play a very important role in highlighting those abuses outside our country. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Edmund. Anisha, I just wanted to ask you, if policy alone is not enough to ensure positive action from the business, what else needs to happen in your view? the million dollar question.
Okay, thanks for that, Roberto. Of course, you know, as my colleagues in the business world who's a part of the panel can say, there's no silver bullet for this. You know, you can't wave a magic wand and it's not going to happen. And a policy is an essential starting point, but it needs to be embedded throughout the business for it to be effective. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper. So implementation is key. And being a responsible business means policy commitments, company values, strategy, and business decisions. They all need to align. So company values and human rights policy statements must be more than just words. If they aren't embedded in the way the business operates and acts, they can damage a company's integrity, the ability to compete, and overall reputation. And once that's done, it's very difficult to go back. Definitely.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, panelists, speakers, thank you very much. I think it's been a very insightful and enlightening discussion. As always, I wish we had more time to take more questions and to go deeper into some of these topics. Very interesting, I must say. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for today. So I wish to thank everybody, everyone, the panelists, but also the attendees. I can see that we still are roughly at the 100 mark. So this is a testament that we have been somehow interesting in what we have been saying. It was definitely a very fruitful and productive session for all of us, but surely for me it was. So we appreciate your interest in learning more about the business case for human rights and the environment, and stay assured that we at BCSD Malaysia will continue to provide relevant knowledge to Malaysia business on this very important topic. And finally, we are pleased to share with you an important update. BCSD Malaysia is partnering, as we said before, as I told you before, with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in rolling out the Business for Human Rights and the Environment as a Malaysia platform. So today's webinar wants to be the kickoff of this initiative. The platform will focus on reinforcing companies' knowledge of the international, regional, and national law and policy frameworks in Malaysia, Southeast Asia, and internationally, underpinning human rights, gender, and environmental and climate change issues. So this will enable companies to identify and effectively describe risks, very important, synergies and tensions in realizing human rights in environmental protection in climate change context. It will also help companies to rethink and adopt new strategies and approaches to better embed the right to a healthy environment into their respective mandates. So the companies, those of you who are interested in learning more about this initiative, this platform, kindly let us know by writing I am interested or something like that in the chat box, and we will definitely get back to you with more information on how to join this initiative. So we hopefully will get back to you in the coming days. So we look forward to seeing you all again. Do follow BCSD Malaysia on social media. We have a number of events coming up. So stay safe and please do stay in touch. Thank you very much and see you soon again. Thank you.